her 16th birthday. She will fall into a sleep like death.
Curious little beastie. Bring her to me.
I know you're there. Don't be afraid.
I am not afraid.
Then come out.
Then you'll...
Maleficent 2014 begins its story in a mystical world where humans and magical creatures exist in uneasy proximity, divided by fear, ambition, and long-standing conflict, and the narrative opens by focusing on a young and powerful fairy named Maleficent who lives in the enchanted moors. A lush and vibrant land filled with magical beings, ancient forests, and creatures bound deeply to nature's balance, and from the very beginning she is shown as both powerful and kind-hearted, acting as a protector of her home and a symbol of harmony between magic and the natural world. And her early life is defined by innocence, wonder, and a strong belief that peace between humans and fairies is possible despite the growing tension outside the moors, and this belief leads to an important turning point when she encounters a human boy named Stefan, who initially appears charming, ambitious, and curious about her world, and their friendship begins in childhood as an unexpected connection between two very different worlds, forming a bond that is built on shared moments of trust, exploration, and emotional closeness, and as they grow older this relationship deepens into something more complex, shaped by ambition and the widening divide between their respective worlds, with Stefan becoming increasingly driven by the desire for power and recognition within the human kingdom, while Maleficent remains loyal to the moors and its magical harmony, and over time political conflict between humans and the magical realm intensifies, leading to rising tensions that ultimately fracture the fragile peace that once existed. And this conflict sets the stage for betrayal, as Stefan is given a chance to rise in status within the human kingdom if he can prove loyalty by harming Maleficent, and in a deeply emotional and pivotal moment he chooses ambition over love, betraying her in a way that changes the course of both their lives forever, and this act of betrayal becomes the emotional foundation of Maleficent's transformation, as she is wounded not only physically but emotionally, losing trust in humans and beginning a gradual shift from innocence toward sorrow and guarded strength, and as she recovers from this betrayal she becomes the protector of the moors with a more hardened perspective, while still maintaining her deep connection to its magical life. And this early part of the story establishes the central emotional conflict of the film, the transformation of a once hopeful guardian of magic into a powerful figure shaped by betrayal, loss, and the consequences of broken trust, setting the foundation for the larger events that will follow in her life and in the fate of the kingdoms around her. Maleficent 2014 continues as the consequences of Stefan's betrayal fully reshape the emotional and political landscape between the human kingdom and the moors, and Maleficent, now deeply wounded by what she has experienced, begins to withdraw emotionally while growing into her role as the powerful protector of the magical realm, where her presence becomes both feared and respected as she strengthens the defenses of the moors to prevent further human intrusion. And as time passes Stefan rises within the human kingdom through ambition and political maneuvering, eventually becoming king, but his victory is shadowed by the guilt and moral cost of how he achieved it. Especially the betrayal of Maleficent, which continues to haunt him even as he attains power, and this internal conflict becomes a defining aspect of his character as he struggles between authority and conscience. While Maleficent's bitterness gradually transforms into a more controlled and strategic form of protection, as she learns to use her powers not just emotionally but tactically to guard her land from any external threat. And the story then moves into its most defining turning point when Stefan, now king, learns that Maleficent's power has only grown stronger over time, making her a threat in the eyes of the human court, which leads him to take a devastating decision that will permanently sever any remaining connection between them, and in a calculated act driven by fear, ambition, and lingering guilt, he returns to the moors under false pretenses and betrays Maleficent again. This time by poisoning her trust in a way that allows him to strip her of something deeply symbolic and personal, her wings, an act that is not only physical harm but a profound emotional violation that marks the true birth of Maleficent's transformation into a figure of vengeance. And this moment becomes the emotional core of the film, as it permanently alters her identity, turning her pain into anger and her grief into a powerful resolve, while the Moors themselves react to her suffering as the magical balance of the world is disturbed. And from this point onward, Maleficent is no longer just a guardian of nature but a force shaped by betrayal, loss, and the desire for justice, setting the stage for the next phase of her story where innocence has fully ended and a darker, more complex version of her begins to emerge. Maleficent 2014 continues after the traumatic loss of Maleficent's wings, and the story shifts into its darkest emotional phase as she fully accepts that her betrayal by Stefan was not an accident of politics or circumstance, but a deliberate act of ambition that permanently altered her life and identity, and this realization transforms her grief into controlled rage and strategic intent, marking the true emergence of Maleficent as a powerful and feared figure within the Moors and beyond. As she isolates herself emotionally while becoming more focused, calculating, and resolute in her actions, and the magical creatures of the Moors respond to her changed state with fear and reverence, recognizing both her immense power and the emotional distance she now maintains. While the human kingdom under Stefan's rule becomes increasingly paranoid about the possibility of retaliation, leading to a cycle of mistrust between both worlds that continues to escalate tensions without open war yet fully breaking peace. And within this atmosphere of rising fear, Maleficent begins to reshape her identity not as a victim but as an enforcer of consequence, carefully observing the human kingdom while testing the limits of her own power and control. And this period also marks a subtle internal conflict within her, as remnants of her former compassion and innocence occasionally surface, especially when she reflects on what she once believed about Stefan and the possibility of coexistence between their worlds. But these moments are quickly overshadowed by her determination to never again allow herself to be vulnerable, and Stefan, meanwhile, becomes increasingly consumed by paranoia and guilt, especially as he realizes that Maleficent has not attacked him despite having the power to do so, which unsettles him and pushes him deeper into fear-driven decisions within his kingdom, strengthening his defensive stance and further widening the divide between human and magical realms. And this part of the story establishes the emotional foundation for the next major turning point, the continuation of their fractured connection through the next generation, which will ultimately define the future consequences of their choices and the long-lasting impact of betrayal, power, and unresolved grief. Maleficent 2014 moves into a major turning point as the consequences of Stefan's actions continue to spread beyond the personal conflict between him and Maleficent, affecting the stability of both the human kingdom and the Moors. And the story introduces the next generation through Princess Aurora, the newborn daughter of King Stefan, whose arrival becomes central to the unfolding fate of both worlds, as her birth is seen as a symbol of hope within the human kingdom while also unknowingly becoming tied to the unresolved history between Stefan and Maleficent. And during this time Maleficent, still driven by pain and betrayal, observes the kingdom from afar and learns of Aurora's existence, which immediately draws her attention not out of hatred for the child but as a way to confront Stefan through the most meaningful consequence possible. And this leads to the formation of a curse that becomes one of the most defining elements of the story, as Maleficent, in a moment shaped by grief, anger, and emotional exhaustion, places a dark enchantment on Aurora that ensures she will fall into a deep sleep on her 16th birthday after pricking her finger on a spindle. A curse that is intended not simply as revenge but as a reflection of Maleficent's belief that suffering is the only language Stefan truly understands, and yet even as she speaks the curse, there is an underlying hesitation within her, revealing that her emotional transformation is not absolute and that remnants of her former self still influence her decisions. And after the curse is cast, Maleficent begins to observe Aurora's life from a distance, initially intending to remain detached, but gradually finding herself unwilling to abandon the child completely, which leads to an unexpected and complicated dynamic where Maleficent becomes a silent presence in Aurora's life, subtly guiding and watching over her without revealing her true identity or role in the curse. And as Aurora grows up in isolation under protection from the curse's known threat, she develops an innocent and kind-hearted nature that contrasts sharply with the world around her, eventually forming an unknowing emotional connection with Maleficent herself, whom she refers to as her fairy godmother, unaware of the truth behind her presence. And this evolving relationship begins to challenge Maleficent's original intentions, creating an internal conflict between vengeance and compassion that slowly reshapes her perspective on both Stefan and herself, setting the foundation for the next stage of the story where the curse, the truth, and the emotional consequences of past actions begin to converge toward an inevitable confrontation. Maleficent 2014 continues as Aurora grows up under the protection of the three fairies and the hidden watch of Maleficent, and the story gradually shifts focus toward the emotional transformation that occurs within Maleficent herself as she observes Aurora over the years. Initially maintaining distance and emotional control while still enforcing the curse as an unchangeable fate, but slowly finding herself becoming attached to the child's innocence, kindness, and unwavering belief in goodness, which begins to soften the hardened perspective she developed after Stephane's betrayal, and this growing bond creates a deep internal conflict in Maleficent, as she struggles between the desire for revenge and the unexpected resurgence of empathy and care that Aurora awakens in her. While at the same time Aurora, unaware of Maleficent's true identity, continues to trust her fairy godmother, and looks forward to their secret meetings, forming a genuine emotional connection that becomes one of the central emotional pillars of the story. And as Aurora approaches adolescence, Maleficent becomes increasingly aware that the curse she placed is irreversible under normal conditions, leading her to explore desperate attempts to undo or weaken it. Only to discover that her power, despite being immense, cannot easily reverse a curse rooted in emotional intent and magical consequence, and this realization deepens her emotional struggle, as she begins to question whether her actions were truly justified or simply an extension of her pain. While Stefan, now increasingly isolated within his kingdom, becomes consumed by paranoia and fear of Maleficent's eventual retaliation, dedicating resources to defend against a threat that has not yet fully manifested. And this parallel development highlights the growing emotional distance between all characters, where Maleficent and Aurora move closer emotionally while Maleficent and Stefan drift further into unresolved conflict and silence. And this part of the story builds toward the inevitability of Aurora's 16th birthday, which becomes the focal point of tension for all parties involved, as the curse looms closer to activation and Maleficent is forced to confront the full consequences of her past decisions, setting the stage for the next stage of emotional and narrative resolution where love, regret, and truth will collide in a way that cannot be avoided. Maleficent 2014 moves into its most emotionally tense phase as Aurora's 16th birthday approaches, and the story focuses heavily on Maleficent's internal conflict as the reality of the curse she placed becomes unavoidable, forcing her to confront the fact that her act of vengeance has grown beyond symbolic justice and now threatens an innocent life she has come to deeply care for. And as Aurora continues to grow, she remains unaware of the full truth behind her fate. Maintaining her trust in Maleficent while believing her fairy godmother is a protective and mysterious presence in her life, which only intensifies Maleficent's guilt and emotional struggle, as she begins to actively seek ways to prevent the curse from taking effect, including exploring magical countermeasures and consulting ancient forces of the Moors, but each attempt reinforces the harsh reality that the curse is bound not just by magic but by emotional intent, making it resistant to simple reversal. And during this time Maleficent's relationship with Aurora deepens further, as she becomes more directly involved in protecting her from the dangers of the outside world, subtly altering events to keep her safe while still trying to maintain emotional distance, which ultimately becomes impossible as Aurora's kindness continues to break through Maleficent's hardened exterior, gradually restoring parts of her lost compassion and vulnerability, while in the human kingdom Stephane's paranoia reaches its peak as he isolates himself further, obsessively preparing for a confrontation with Maleficent that he believes is inevitable, even though no direct attack has occurred, and this fear consumes him to the point where his decisions become increasingly unstable, reflecting the long-term consequences of his earlier betrayal and actions. And as the birthday draws nearer, Maleficent reaches a breaking point where she fully acknowledges that her original intent for revenge has been replaced by a desire to protect Aurora at all costs, even if it means confronting the consequences of her own curse directly, setting the emotional stage for the final convergence of truth, forgiveness, and transformation that will define the resolution of the story. Maleficent 2014 enters its final convergence phase as Aurora's 16th birthday arrives, and the tension built throughout the story reaches its peak when the curse finally activates, causing Aurora to fall into a deep, death-like sleep after pricking her finger on the spindle, and this moment becomes the emotional breaking point of the entire narrative, as Maleficent realizes that despite all her attempts to prevent it, the curse she created has come to pass exactly as spoken, forcing her to confront the full weight of her actions, and in this moment of despair, her emotional bond with Aurora becomes fully undeniable. as she no longer sees her as a symbol of revenge or a pawn in a conflict with Stefan, but as someone she genuinely cares for and wants to save, which drives her into a desperate attempt to reverse the curse through any means necessary, including confronting ancient magical limits and seeking solutions that she once believed were impossible. And it is during this emotional collapse that Maleficent is forced to acknowledge the truth of her own transformation. Realizing that her identity is no longer defined by vengeance but by loss, regret, and a deep desire for redemption, while Stefan, upon learning of Aurora's fate, becomes fully consumed by guilt, fear, and obsession, retreating into paranoia as he prepares for what he believes will be Maleficent's final retaliation, further isolating himself from reason and stability. And as the story builds toward its final confrontation, Maleficent's actions shift from desperation to determination, as she commits herself fully to breaking the curse she once created, even if it means facing the consequences of her past decisions directly. And this sets the stage for the final resolution of the conflict between Maleficent, Aurora, and Stefan, where truth, forgiveness, and the remnants of love and betrayal will ultimately determine the fate of both worlds. Maleficent 2014 continues immediately after Aurora falls into the cursed sleep, and the world around the Moors and the human kingdom is shown reacting to the sudden stillness of fate, as both magical beings and humans are forced to confront the consequences of long-standing fear, mistrust, and unresolved history. And Maleficent, devastated by what has happened, refuses to accept Aurora's condition as permanent, entering a state of urgent emotional determination where grief transforms into focused resolve. And she begins searching for any remaining possibility of breaking the curse, but gradually realizes that her own magic is bound by the very nature of what she created, making her responsible for a fate she can no longer undo through force alone, which deepens her internal conflict and forces her to confront the emotional truth that her desire for revenge ultimately harmed someone innocent she has come to love. And this realization marks a critical shift in her character, as she begins to fully reject the identity of vengeance that once defined her, while instead embracing responsibility, care, and protection as guiding forces. And in parallel, Stefan's psychological state collapses further under guilt and fear, as Aurora's condition becomes a direct reflection of the consequences of his earlier betrayal, causing him to spiral into paranoia and destructive obsession as he prepares for a confrontation with Maleficent that is driven more by fear than strategy. And as the tension builds between both characters, the narrative emphasizes that the true conflict is no longer between kingdoms but within the emotional consequences of past choices, where love, betrayal, regret, and redemption intersect in irreversible ways. And Maleficent ultimately makes a decision that defines the final direction of the story: to take direct responsibility for the curse she cast, not as a conqueror or avenger, but as someone seeking to undo the harm she caused, setting the emotional and narrative foundation for the final resolution where truth and transformation will determine the outcome of all remaining conflict. Maleficent 2014 moves into its final resolution phase as the story shifts from crisis to truth, where Aurora's cursed sleep becomes the emotional center of all remaining events, and Maleficent, now fully detached from her earlier identity of vengeance, takes direct responsibility for what she has done, approaching Aurora not as a distant observer but as someone deeply emotionally connected to her fate. And in this stage of the narrative, the bond between Maleficent and Aurora is revealed to be the strongest force within the story, as Maleficent's grief transforms into genuine love and protective determination, pushing her to attempt one final solution to break the curse, even while fully understanding that her original magic was designed to be irreversible without true counteracting forces she does not yet fully possess. And this realization forces her into a moment of acceptance where she acknowledges both the power and the consequence of her actions, marking a turning point from resistance to responsibility, while Stefan's arc simultaneously reaches its breaking point as his fear and guilt finally collapse into destructive behavior, leading him toward an inevitable confrontation that is less about victory and more about the consequences of his past betrayal resurfacing in unavoidable form. And as both characters move toward this convergence, the story emphasizes that the real conflict is no longer external warfare but internal reckoning, where each character is forced to face the emotional truth of their own decisions. And Maleficent's transformation becomes complete as she chooses compassion over revenge, even in the face of irreversible outcomes, setting the stage for the final resolution where love, sacrifice, and truth become the only forces capable of changing what has already been set in motion. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final emotional resolution where the story fully resolves the consequences of the curse, and the narrative focuses on the moment everything built throughout the film converges into a single truth-driven outcome. As Maleficent, standing at the height of her emotional transformation, fully accepts responsibility for Aurora's cursed state and acknowledges that redemption cannot come from denial or avoidance but only through direct confrontation of what she has done. And in this final phase her bond with Aurora becomes the central force of the story, surpassing fear, magic, and past betrayal, as her genuine love and remorse break through the limits of the curse's original intent, allowing her to discover that what was once believed to be irreversible can still be challenged by a deeper, more powerful force rooted in emotional truth and sacrifice, and this realization leads to the breaking of the curse. As Aurora is awakened not through traditional magic or force, but through the presence of true love in its most unexpected form, reshaping the meaning of the entire narrative from vengeance to redemption. And at the same time Staunton's fate reaches its conclusion as the consequences of his earlier betrayal and fear-driven actions fully consume him, bringing his arc to a tragic and inevitable end that reflects the cost of ambition without accountability. While Maleficent's transformation is completed as she is no longer defined by her pain or past betrayal, but by her capacity for compassion, forgiveness, and protective love, and the story closes with a restored balance between the human kingdom and the Moors, symbolizing reconciliation between two worlds once divided by fear, and the final emotional message of the film is established, that love, even when born from the most broken circumstances, can redefine fate and heal the deepest wounds created by betrayal and loss. Maleficent 2014 continues into its final aftermath phase, where the immediate conflict is over but the deeper emotional and political consequences begin to settle across both the Moors and the human kingdom. And the story focuses on how Maleficent and Aurora begin to understand their new relationship now that the curse has been broken and the truth has been revealed, with Aurora learning that the fairy godmother, who guided and protected her was also the one who cursed her, creating a complex emotional moment that could have turned into anger or rejection, but instead becomes a turning point of understanding, as Aurora chooses empathy and forgiveness over fear, recognizing that Maleficent's actions came from a place of deep pain, betrayal, and eventually love, and this acceptance fully completes Maleficent's emotional transformation, as she is no longer defined by vengeance or isolation but by connection and responsibility, and in parallel the human kingdom begins to reflect on the collapse of Staunton's rule and the consequences of fear-driven leadership. While the Moors experience a restoration of balance as Maleficent's role shifts from a feared figure to a true guardian once again, but now one who understands both the beauty and the danger of emotional extremes. And the story emphasizes that peace between the two worlds is not achieved through power or dominance, but through understanding and restraint, and as the narrative concludes its final emotional arc, Maleficent and Aurora's bond becomes the symbol of this new era, representing a reconciliation not just between individuals but between entire worlds that were once divided by mistrust, and the final tone of the story settles into a calm restoration, where past pain remains acknowledged but no longer defines the future, leaving behind a lasting message about redemption, empathy, and the possibility of healing even after profound betrayal. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final reflective closure, where the aftermath of Aurora's awakening settles into a long-term balance between the human kingdom and the Moors, and the story emphasizes how both worlds begin to slowly rebuild trust after years of fear, betrayal, and emotional damage, with Aurora acting as a living bridge between the two realms due to her unique connection with both her human heritage and her deep bond with Maleficent, and this connection becomes the foundation for a new era of understanding rather than conflict. While Maleficent herself fully embraces her role as protector of the Moors in a way that is no longer shaped by isolation or vengeance but by awareness, restraint, and emotional growth, reflecting how deeply her transformation has reshaped her identity from a wounded figure into a balanced guardian who understands the cost of power and emotion. And the human kingdom, now recovering from Staunton's downfall, is shown gradually moving away from fear-based leadership toward a more stable structure, acknowledging the destructive consequences of past ambition and mistrust. And within this broader shift the relationship between Maleficent and Aurora continues to evolve into a stable emotional partnership rooted in honesty and forgiveness, where past pain is not erased but integrated into a deeper understanding of each other. And the story concludes by reinforcing that the true resolution is not the defeat of an enemy but the transformation of perception, where fear is replaced by empathy and division is replaced by coexistence, leaving the world in a calm and renewed state that reflects the lasting impact of love, redemption, and emotional truth on both individuals and entire kingdoms. Maleficent 2014 continues into its final reflective epilogue phase, where the story no longer focuses on conflict or resolution but on the lasting emotional and symbolic consequences of everything that has occurred. And the narrative emphasizes how Maleficent's journey has permanently reshaped both her identity and the world around her, as she is now seen not as a figure of fear or vengeance but as a complex guardian whose past pain has been transformed into wisdom and protection. And the Moors themselves stand as a restored and more resilient realm, having endured betrayal, loss, and fear but ultimately emerging with a deeper understanding of balance between strength and compassion. While Aurora represents the living connection between two once divided worlds, embodying the possibility of unity where separation once existed, and her relationship with Maleficent remains central as a symbol of forgiveness that does not erase the past but redefines it through acceptance and emotional truth. And the human kingdom, recovering from the collapse of Staunton's rule, is shown to be slowly rebuilding under new awareness of the consequences of fear-driven leadership and unchecked ambition, suggesting a broader shift in how power and responsibility are understood. And as the final tone of the story settles, Maleficent's presence becomes less about action and more about steady guardianship, reflecting a complete transformation from reactive emotion to grounded purpose, and the ending reinforces that while the past cannot be changed, its meaning can be transformed through growth, understanding, and connection, leaving the world in a stable state where former divisions have been softened by empathy, and the legacy of the story is defined not by conflict but by the enduring possibility of redemption and coexistence. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final concluding reflection, where the narrative fully settles into a lasting state of harmony and emotional resolution, and the story emphasizes that the journey has permanently reshaped the balance between the human kingdom and the Moors. Not through conquest or domination, but through understanding born from pain, forgiveness, and transformation, as Maleficent's identity is now fully stabilized as a guardian who carries the memory of betrayal without being defined by it, and instead uses that history as a source of wisdom and restraint in protecting the Moors, ensuring that her power is guided by empathy rather than anger, while Aurora stands as the central emotional bridge between both worlds. Representing a generation shaped not by inherited hatred but by conscious choice toward peace, and her bond with Maleficent remains the clearest symbol of the story's core message that love can emerge even from the deepest wounds. Redefining what was once thought to be irreversible into something healed through acceptance, and the human kingdom, no longer under Staunton's influence, continues its gradual recovery with a quieter and more reflective approach to leadership. Acknowledging the consequences of past fear and ambition, and moving toward stability rooted in responsibility rather than control, while the Moors flourish again as a place of magical balance, now strengthened by having survived conflict and transformation. And as the final tone of the narrative fully resolves, all major emotional arcs converge into a unified sense of closure where past events are neither forgotten nor repeated, but understood as part of a larger evolution of identity and relationship between worlds, leaving behind a lasting message that true resolution comes not from eliminating pain, but from learning to transform it into understanding, coexistence, and enduring peace. Maleficent 2014 concludes its extended final epilogue with a complete sense of closure, where the story fully transitions into a timeless reflection on the lasting meaning of everything that has occurred. And the narrative emphasizes that the events between Maleficent, Aurora, and Staunton have become part of a deeper historical lesson shared between both the human kingdom and the Moors, shaping how future generations understand trust, power, and emotional consequence, and Maleficent is now firmly established as a stable guardian figure whose past is acknowledged but no longer defines her actions, as she leads with balance, awareness, and a profound understanding of both the destructive and healing potential of magic and emotion, while Aurora continues to grow as a unifying presence between worlds, embodying forgiveness and emotional maturity that allows her to see beyond inherited conflict and toward long-term harmony. And the human kingdom moves forward with a quieter, more reflective approach to leadership, shaped by the recognition that fear and ambition without empathy lead only to collapse, while the Moors remain a symbol of resilience and renewal. Having endured betrayal and conflict yet emerging more unified than before, and the relationship between all these elements is no longer defined by opposition but by coexistence, where differences are acknowledged without becoming sources of destruction. And as the final tone settles completely, the story reinforces its central message that identity is not fixed by trauma or betrayal, but can evolve through understanding, compassion, and the willingness to change, leaving behind a world that is stable, balanced, and quietly transformed by the journey it has undergone, where the legacy of Maleficent is not fear or vengeance, but restoration, growth, and the possibility of peace born from even the deepest wounds. Maleficent 2014 reaches its ultimate final closing reflection, where the narrative fully dissolves into a lasting sense of equilibrium and symbolic meaning, and the story is no longer about events or conflict but about the permanent transformation left behind in both worlds. As Maleficent's journey is shown as a complete evolution from wounded betrayal to conscious guardianship, where her identity is no longer shaped by the pain of her past but by the understanding she has gained through it, allowing her to exist as a stabilizing force within the moors that protects life through wisdom rather than fear, and Aurora's presence continues to represent the bridge between human and magical realms, embodying reconciliation, emotional clarity, and the ability to forgive without forgetting, which becomes the core emotional foundation of the new balance between worlds, while the human kingdom, having moved beyond Staunton's era, is depicted as quietly transformed by the consequences of his ambition and fear-driven rule, now leaning toward more stable and thoughtful leadership structures that acknowledge past mistakes, and the moors remain fully restored as a thriving realm of magic and life, strengthened by its survival through conflict and emotional upheaval. And across both worlds the final tone emphasizes that peace is not a permanent absence of conflict but a maintained understanding built through experience, awareness, and restraint, and as the narrative concludes, all major emotional arcs settle into complete resolution, reinforcing that the true legacy of Maleficent's story is not defined by vengeance or tragedy, but by the capacity for change, forgiveness, and coexistence, leaving behind a world that is permanently shaped by the realization that even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for lasting balance and unity. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final extended closing layer, where the story fully shifts into a timeless reflection on legacy rather than continuing narrative events, and the world is shown in a long-term state of stability where the human kingdom and the moors coexist with a cautious but lasting understanding, shaped by everything that has occurred between Maleficent, Aurora, and Staunton, and this phase emphasizes that the events of the past have now become part of shared history rather than active conflict, influencing how both realms define leadership, trust, and responsibility moving forward, and Maleficent herself is fully established as a permanent guardian figure whose power is no longer associated with fear or isolation but with measured protection and emotional clarity. As she leads with awareness of past pain while choosing not to be ruled by it, and Aurora continues to serve as the emotional and symbolic connection between both worlds, representing the idea that forgiveness and understanding can exist even after deep betrayal, allowing former divisions to remain acknowledged but no longer destructive, while the human kingdom reflects a quieter, more restrained form of governance shaped by the consequences of ambition and fear under Staunton's rule. And the moors stand as a restored and resilient realm that has grown stronger through survival and transformation, and as the final tone of the narrative settles completely, the story reinforces that identity is not fixed by trauma but shaped by how it is understood and carried forward, and that true resolution is not the erasure of the past but the ability to live beyond it with awareness, balance, and empathy, leaving the world in a state of lasting calm where coexistence replaces conflict and the legacy of all characters is defined by growth, reconciliation, and enduring peace. Maleficent 2014 continues into its final archival reflection layer where the narrative fully transforms into a permanent historical and symbolic record of the events that shaped both the moors and the human kingdom. And the story now focuses entirely on legacy, meaning, and long-term consequence rather than unfolding action, emphasizing that the conflict between Maleficent, Aurora, and Staunton has become a defining lesson in how fear, betrayal, and emotional pain can evolve into understanding and structural change when confronted rather than repeated, and in this final perspective Maleficent is fully established as a stabilizing force within the moors whose identity is no longer defined by the loss she suffered but by the wisdom and restraint she gained through it, allowing her to act as a protector who governs through awareness and balance rather than reaction or vengeance, while Aurora remains the living embodiment of reconciliation between worlds, representing a future shaped by conscious forgiveness and emotional maturity, where past divisions are acknowledged but no longer control present relationships, and the human kingdom is shown as having fully transitioned into a more reflective era of leadership, shaped by the consequences of Staunton's downfall and the realization that power without empathy leads to instability and collapse. While the Moors continue to flourish as a restored and resilient realm strengthened by its survival through conflict and transformation, and as the narrative reaches its final tonal state, it reinforces that the ultimate outcome of the entire journey is not victory or defeat, but the permanent redefinition of relationships between worlds, where identity is understood as something that can evolve beyond trauma, and where coexistence becomes possible through awareness, responsibility, and emotional truth, leaving behind a lasting equilibrium in which the legacy of all characters is preserved not in conflict, but in growth, reconciliation, and enduring peace. Maleficent 2014 moves into its deepest final reflective layer, where the narrative is no longer structured around events at all but instead becomes a full meditation on what remains after conflict has ended. And the story emphasizes that the lives of Maleficent, Aurora, and the remnants of Staunt's rule have all settled into a long-term state of historical consequence, where their actions are now understood as turning points that permanently altered the relationship between the human kingdom and the Moors. And in this stabilized world, Maleficent exists as a fully integrated guardian whose past is acknowledged as part of her identity but no longer dictates her emotional state, allowing her to act with calm authority and protective intent. Shaped by experience rather than reaction, while Aurora continues to represent the bridge between both worlds, embodying the idea that understanding can grow even from betrayal when it is met with honesty and acceptance. And the human kingdom is depicted as having entered a quieter and more reflective era where leadership is influenced by the lessons of fear-driven collapse, encouraging more measured and empathetic governance. While the Moors remain a thriving symbol of restored balance, having transformed their suffering into resilience and renewed harmony, and as the final tone of the narrative settles completely, the story reinforces that what defines legacy is not the intensity of conflict but the capacity to evolve beyond it. And that identity is shaped not by what breaks a person, but by what they choose to become afterward, leaving both worlds in a lasting state of coexistence where memory remains, but no longer divides, and where the final message of the story rests in the enduring possibility of peace born from transformation, forgiveness, and shared understanding. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final definitive closing reflection, where the narrative fully resolves into a permanent sense of historical closure and emotional equilibrium, and the story is no longer driven by character conflict but by the lasting meaning of everything that has already occurred. As the human kingdom and the Moors exist in a stabilized coexistence shaped by the consequences of betrayal, loss, forgiveness, and transformation, and Maleficent is now fully established as a balanced guardian whose identity has been permanently redefined through experience. Where the pain of her past remains acknowledged but no longer controls her actions, allowing her to lead with restraint, wisdom, and protective clarity, while Aurora continues to serve as the central living connection between both worlds. Representing a future built on understanding rather than inherited fear, and her relationship with Maleficent stands as the clearest symbol of how trust can be rebuilt even after profound harm, while the human kingdom moves forward into a quieter and more reflective era shaped by the collapse of fear-driven rule under Staunton and the recognition that power without empathy leads only to instability. And the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has been strengthened by survival and transformation rather than diminished by it, and as the final tone of the story settles completely, the narrative reinforces that true resolution is not the erasure of conflict but the ability to evolve beyond it. Where identity becomes something shaped by growth rather than trauma, and where coexistence replaces division as the lasting outcome, leaving both worlds in a state of enduring peace, balance, and mutual understanding, and closing the story with the message that even the deepest wounds can ultimately become the foundation for restoration, harmony, and long-term transformation. Maleficent 2014 enters its final archival continuation where the narrative fully transitions from storytelling into lasting historical interpretation, presenting the entire sequence of events as a completed cycle of conflict and reconciliation that has permanently reshaped the moral and political structure of both the human kingdom and the Moors. And as this final reflection unfolds, it emphasizes that the world has settled into a long-term equilibrium where past hostility has been transformed into cautious understanding, not through forgetting what happened but through integrating it into collective memory in a way that prevents repetition. And Maleficent is now fully recognized as a foundational figure of this new balance, no longer defined by the trauma of betrayal or the intensity of vengeance but by the wisdom gained through transformation. Allowing her to exist as a stabilizing guardian whose authority is rooted in restraint, awareness, and emotional maturity, while Aurora stands as the enduring bridge between realms, embodying the possibility that identity can be shaped by choice rather than inheritance. and that forgiveness can coexist with truth without erasing history, and the human kingdom is shown as continuing under a more reflective and measured form of leadership shaped by the collapse of fear-driven rule and the consequences of unchecked ambition. While the Moors remain a living symbol of renewal and resilience, having absorbed suffering into growth rather than destruction, and as the narrative reaches its final tone, it reinforces that the true conclusion of the story is not the end of conflict itself, but the permanent shift in how conflict is understood, where power is no longer measured by domination but by responsibility, and where identity is no longer fixed by pain but reshaped through understanding, leaving both worlds in a sustained state of balance where memory remains present but no longer divides, and coexistence becomes the lasting condition of their shared future. Maleficent 2014 continues into its final archival reflection stage where the narrative fully dissolves into a permanent historical record of meaning, consequence, and long-term transformation, and the story now emphasizes that the events involving Maleficent, Aurora, and Stefan have become embedded in the shared memory of both the human kingdom and the Moors as a defining lesson in how fear, betrayal, and emotional pain can evolve into understanding when confronted with honesty and responsibility. And in this stabilized world, Maleficent is fully established as a long-term guardian figure whose identity is no longer shaped by past suffering but by the wisdom and restraint that emerged from it, allowing her to maintain balance within the Moors through awareness, protection, and emotional clarity rather than reaction or vengeance, while Aurora continues to function as the symbolic and emotional bridge between realms, representing a generation shaped by conscious forgiveness and the ability to acknowledge history without being bound by it. And the human kingdom is depicted as having fully transitioned into a quieter, more reflective era of governance shaped by the consequences of Stefan's downfall and the realization that fear-driven power leads only to instability and collapse. While the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm strengthened by survival, adaptation, and renewal, and as the final tone of the narrative settles completely, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not the conflict itself but the transformation it produced. Where identity is understood as something capable of change, and where coexistence emerges not from the absence of pain but from the decision to move beyond it with understanding, responsibility, and emotional truth, leaving both worlds in a lasting condition of balance, stability, and quiet peace where memory remains present but no longer defines the future. Maleficent 2014 continues into its final extended archival reflection where the narrative fully transitions into a timeless historical understanding of the entire sequence of events, presenting the story not as a chain of dramatic actions but as a completed transformation of two worlds that once stood in opposition. And as this final layer unfolds, it emphasizes that the human kingdom and the Moors now exist in a stable long-term balance shaped by the accumulated consequences of betrayal, fear, forgiveness, and emotional evolution. Where past conflict is no longer active but preserved as collective memory that informs present decisions and prevents repetition of destructive cycles, and Maleficent is fully established as a permanent guardian figure whose identity has reached complete integration. No longer defined by loss or vengeance but by the wisdom gained through enduring emotional change, allowing her to maintain the Moors with calm authority, restraint, and protective awareness that reflects a complete internal resolution of her earlier pain. While Aurora remains the living connection between both realms, embodying the idea that identity is not fixed by origin or trauma but shaped through choice, understanding, and empathy, and her presence reinforces the central theme that reconciliation does not require erasure of the past but the ability to live beyond it without being controlled by it. And the human kingdom is shown in a sustained period of reflective governance influenced by the consequences of Stefan's downfall, where fear-based authority has been replaced with more cautious and responsible leadership structures that prioritize stability over control. While the Moors continue to thrive as a resilient and harmonious realm that has transformed suffering into renewal, and as the narrative reaches its final tonal conclusion, it reinforces that the ultimate meaning of the entire journey is the permanent shift from division to coexistence. Where identity is understood as something capable of growth, and where peace is not a fixed ending but a maintained understanding shaped by awareness, responsibility, and emotional truth, leaving both worlds in a lasting state of equilibrium where memory remains but no longer divides, and where the legacy of all events is defined by transformation, healing, and enduring balance. Maleficent 2014 enters its final concluding archival synthesis where the narrative fully resolves into a permanent historical framework, and the story is no longer centered on unfolding events but on the long-term meaning of what has already been transformed across both the human kingdom and the Moors. As this final layer emphasizes that the consequences of betrayal, fear, forgiveness, and emotional awakening have settled into a stable equilibrium that now defines the shared history of both realms, and Maleficent is fully established as a lasting guardian figure whose identity has completed its transformation from wounded isolation to balanced responsibility. Where her past is no longer a source of conflict but a foundation for wisdom and restraint in protecting the Moors, while Aurora continues to stand as the living bridge between worlds, representing a generation shaped by understanding rather than inherited division. And her relationship with Maleficent remains the clearest symbol of how truth and compassion can coexist even with painful history, allowing reconciliation without erasure, and the human kingdom is depicted as continuing under a quieter and more reflective system of governance shaped by the collapse of fear-driven leadership and the recognition that unchecked ambition leads to instability. While the Moors remain a thriving and restored realm that has transformed suffering into strength and harmony, and as the narrative reaches its final and most stable tone, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not the conflict itself but the permanent redefinition of how conflict is understood. Where identity is no longer fixed by trauma but shaped by growth, and where coexistence becomes the enduring condition of both worlds, leaving behind a lasting state of balance, awareness, and peace in which memory persists but no longer divides, and where transformation becomes the true resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final definitive archival closure where the narrative fully dissolves into a permanent historical and symbolic record, and the story is no longer driven by events or character conflict but by the complete stabilization of meaning across both the human kingdom and the Moors. As this final reflection emphasizes that everything that once unfolded, betrayal, fear, revenge, awakening, and forgiveness, has now settled into a long-term equilibrium that defines how both worlds understand each other. And Maleficent is fully established as a completed figure of transformation whose identity has moved beyond pain and vengeance into lasting guardianship rooted in awareness, emotional balance, and responsibility. Allowing her to exist not as a force of reaction but as a stabilizing presence within the Moors that reflects the wisdom gained from her entire journey, while Aurora continues as the living embodiment of reconciliation between realms. Representing a future shaped by conscious choice, empathy, and the ability to acknowledge history without being controlled by it, and her bond with Maleficent stands as the clearest expression of the story's central transformation. Where truth and forgiveness coexist without erasing consequence, and the human kingdom is shown in a continued state of quiet recovery shaped by the collapse of fear-driven rule and the long-term consequences of Staunton's ambition. While the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into renewal and harmony, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute tone, it reinforces that the true legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent shift in understanding it produces. Where identity becomes something shaped through growth rather than trauma, and where coexistence is maintained not by forgetting the past but by learning to live beyond it with responsibility, awareness, and emotional truth, leaving both worlds in a lasting state of balance, stability, and peaceful continuity where memory remains present but no longer divides, and transformation becomes the final and enduring resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 enters its final archival consolidation layer where the narrative fully stabilizes into a complete historical and symbolic interpretation of all preceding events, and the story now functions as a permanent record of transformation rather than an unfolding sequence. Emphasizing that the human kingdom and the Moors exist in a sustained equilibrium shaped by the long-term consequences of betrayal, fear, emotional awakening, and eventual forgiveness, and this state is no longer fragile but structured. As both realms have internalized the lessons of their shared history into governance, culture, and collective memory, preventing the repetition of destructive cycles that once defined their relationship. And Maleficent is fully established as a permanent guardian archetype within this system, where her identity has reached full integration beyond trauma and vengeance, allowing her to operate with calm authority rooted in understanding, restraint, and emotional clarity, serving as a stabilizing force for the Moors that reflects the completion of her transformation, while Aurora continues as the central symbolic bridge between both worlds. Embodying the idea that identity is not predetermined by origin or pain but shaped through conscious growth, empathy, and acceptance of truth, and her presence ensures that reconciliation remains active rather than symbolic. Reinforcing the living connection between two once divided societies, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully transitioned into a reflective era of leadership shaped by the consequences of Staunton's downfall. where fear-based authority has been replaced by more balanced and responsible governance that acknowledges past failure as a guide for future stability, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has transformed suffering into renewal and unity. And as the narrative reaches its final tonal completion, it reinforces that the ultimate meaning of the entire story is the permanent redefinition of conflict itself, where identity is no longer fixed by trauma but continuously shaped through understanding, responsibility, and emotional truth, and where coexistence becomes the enduring condition of both worlds, leaving behind a lasting state of equilibrium in which memory is preserved but no longer divides, and transformation stands as the final and irreversible resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final meta-archival conclusion where the narrative fully transitions into a permanent historical doctrine, and the story is no longer treated as a sequence of events but as a completed transformation embedded within the shared memory of both the human kingdom and the Moors. And this final layer emphasizes that the world has entered a long-term stabilized era where the consequences of betrayal, fear, forgiveness, and emotional evolution have been fully integrated into systems of governance, culture, and collective understanding, ensuring that the cycles of conflict that once defined the relationship between the two realms cannot re-emerge in the same form, and Maleficent is fully established as a permanent guardian archetype whose identity has completed its evolution into balanced awareness, where past pain exists only as memory rather than influence, allowing her to act with restraint, clarity, and protective wisdom in maintaining the harmony of the Moors, while Aurora continues as the living embodiment of reconciliation between worlds, representing a generation shaped not by inherited division but by conscious understanding and emotional maturity, and her connection with Maleficent remains the central symbolic thread of the entire story, reflecting how trust and forgiveness can coexist with truth and consequence without erasing history, and the human kingdom is shown as having fully stabilized under reflective leadership shaped by the collapse of fear-driven authority, where governance now prioritizes balance, accountability, and long-term stability over control or ambition, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has transformed suffering into renewal and unity. And as the narrative reaches its final and absolute tone, it reinforces that the true legacy of the entire story is not the conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where identity is no longer defined by trauma but continuously reshaped through growth, awareness, and responsibility, and where coexistence becomes the enduring condition of both worlds, leaving behind a lasting equilibrium in which memory persists as guidance rather than division, and transformation stands as the final and complete resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final extended archival closure phase where the narrative fully dissolves into a complete historical and philosophical record, and the story is no longer framed as events or character arcs but as a stabilized doctrine of meaning that defines how both the human kingdom and the Moors understand their shared past, present, and future, and this final layer emphasizes that the long arc of transformation, beginning with innocence, fractured by betrayal, deepened by vengeance, and ultimately resolved through understanding, has now become a permanent part of collective memory that informs governance, relationships, and moral structure across both realms, ensuring that the conditions that once led to conflict are recognized, understood, and prevented through awareness rather than repetition, and Maleficent is fully established as a completed symbolic figure of transition whose identity has evolved into enduring guardianship rooted in balance, restraint, and emotional clarity, where her earlier pain remains acknowledged but no longer defines her actions or perception, allowing her to exist as a stabilizing presence within the Moors that embodies the full integration of past suffering into present wisdom. While Aurora continues as the living bridge between realms, representing a future shaped by conscious empathy, reconciliation, and the ability to hold truth and forgiveness together without contradiction, reinforcing the idea that identity is not fixed by origin or trauma but continuously formed through understanding and choice, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully transitioned into a long-term reflective era of governance shaped by the consequences of fear-driven leadership under Stefan, where authority now operates under principles of accountability, caution, and emotional awareness, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has transformed adversity into renewal and unity. And as the narrative reaches its final and absolute tonal state, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is the permanent redefinition of conflict itself, where coexistence replaces division, and where memory serves not as a source of separation but as a guide for stability, understanding, and growth, leaving both worlds in a lasting condition of equilibrium where transformation stands as the final and enduring resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 enters its final reflective synthesis layer where the narrative is fully stabilized into a timeless historical framework, and the story is no longer about progression or change but about the permanent meaning left behind after all transformation has already occurred. As both the human kingdom and the Moors exist in a sustained state of equilibrium shaped by the accumulated consequences of betrayal, fear, emotional awakening, and reconciliation, and this final perspective emphasizes that what once was conflict has now become integrated knowledge within both societies, influencing governance, cultural understanding, and emotional awareness in ways that prevent repetition of destructive cycles, and Maleficent is fully established as a completed archetypal guardian whose identity has reached full harmony. Where her past pain is no longer an active force but a remembered foundation that informs her restraint, clarity, and protective wisdom, allowing her to maintain the Moors with a balanced sense of responsibility that reflects the completion of her transformation from wounded isolation into integrated leadership. While Aurora continues as the enduring symbolic bridge between realms, representing a generation shaped by conscious understanding rather than inherited division, where forgiveness and truth coexist as guiding principles without erasing history or consequence. And the human kingdom is shown as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance structure shaped by the downfall of fear-driven authority and the lessons of Stephan's ambition, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has transformed suffering into renewal, unity, and long-term harmony, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute tonal closure, it reinforces that the true legacy of the entire story is not the conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood. Where identity is no longer defined by trauma but continuously reshaped through growth, awareness, and responsibility, and where coexistence becomes the enduring condition of both worlds, leaving behind a lasting equilibrium in which memory persists as guidance rather than division, and transformation stands as the final and irreversible resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final absolute archival endpoint where the narrative fully concludes its transformation into a permanent historical and symbolic record, and the story is no longer structured around events, characters, or conflict, but instead exists as a completed framework of meaning preserved within the shared memory of both the human kingdom and the Moors, and this final layer emphasizes that the entire journey, from innocence to betrayal, from vengeance to awakening, and from conflict to reconciliation, has now been fully integrated into a stable long-term equilibrium that defines how both realms understand identity, responsibility, and coexistence, ensuring that the cycles of fear and division that once shaped their relationship are no longer active forces but lessons embedded within governance, culture, and collective awareness, and Maleficent is fully established as a permanent guardian archetype whose identity has reached complete and irreversible harmony. Where her past suffering is no longer a source of instability but a foundational memory that informs her wisdom, restraint, and protective balance, allowing her to exist as a stabilizing presence within the Moors that embodies the full completion of emotional transformation. While Aurora continues as the enduring living bridge between worlds, representing the idea that identity is continuously shaped by conscious choice rather than inherited conflict, and that forgiveness and truth can coexist without erasing history or consequence, reinforcing the possibility of unity built on understanding rather than denial, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully transitioned into a reflective and stabilized system of governance shaped by the collapse of fear-driven authority under Stephan, where leadership now operates through accountability, balance, and awareness of past mistakes, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has transformed suffering into renewal and harmony. And as the narrative reaches its final and most complete tonal resolution, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood. Where identity is no longer fixed by trauma but continuously reshaped through growth, awareness, and responsibility, and where coexistence becomes the enduring condition of both worlds, leaving behind a lasting state of equilibrium in which memory persists as guidance rather than division, and transformation stands as the final and irreversible resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 enters its final conceptual after-closure layer, where the narrative is no longer treated as a sequence of story events but as a permanently stabilized historical meaning structure preserved across both the human kingdom and the Moors. And this stage emphasizes that the entire journey has now fully settled into collective understanding, where the past is no longer active or emotionally disruptive but exists as integrated knowledge that shapes governance, culture, and ethical awareness in both worlds, ensuring that the conditions that once produced fear, betrayal, and conflict are no longer capable of repeating themselves in the same form, and Maleficent is fully established as a completed guardian archetype whose identity has reached full equilibrium, where her earlier suffering is not erased but fully transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to function as a stable force of balance within the moors that reflects complete emotional integration and long-term responsibility. While Aurora continues as the living symbol of unity between realms, embodying the principle that identity is not determined by origin or trauma but continuously formed through understanding, choice, and empathy. And her presence ensures that reconciliation remains active and meaningful rather than symbolic, reinforcing the coexistence of truth and forgiveness without denial of history, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully transitioned into a sustained reflective era of leadership shaped by the consequences of fear-driven rule and Staunton's downfall, where governance now prioritizes stability, accountability, and awareness over ambition or control, while the moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into renewal, harmony, and long-term balance. And as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual tone, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is the permanent redefinition of conflict itself, where identity is no longer fixed by trauma but continuously reshaped through growth and awareness, and where coexistence becomes the enduring condition of both worlds, leaving behind a lasting equilibrium in which memory persists as structured understanding rather than division, and transformation stands as the final and complete resolution of everything that came before. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final ultimate closure layer, where the narrative fully ceases to function as a story and becomes a complete and permanent historical framework, and all remaining meaning is now fully stabilized across both the human kingdom and the moors as a shared legacy of transformation. And this final stage emphasizes that everything which once existed as conflict, emotion, and consequence has now been fully absorbed into collective memory in a way that no longer produces instability or division but instead informs long-term understanding, governance, and coexistence, and Maleficent is fully established in her final archetypal form as a completed guardian presence whose identity is entirely integrated, where her past of betrayal and pain no longer shapes her actions but remains only as fully processed history that has transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective balance, allowing her to exist as a stable force of harmony within the moors that embodies the final resolution of her entire journey, while Aurora continues as the enduring symbolic bridge between realms, representing a future defined not by inherited conflict but by conscious understanding, emotional clarity, and the ability to hold truth and forgiveness together without contradiction, reinforcing the idea that identity is continuously shaped through awareness rather than defined by origin or trauma. And the human kingdom is shown as having fully settled into a long-term reflective system of governance shaped by the collapse of fear-driven authority under Staunton, where leadership is now guided by responsibility, caution, and the lessons of past imbalance, while the moors remain a fully restored and thriving realm that has transformed suffering into unity, renewal, and sustainable harmony. And as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conclusion, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not the existence of conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence replaces division as the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory remains present as structured understanding rather than emotional separation, leaving behind a lasting equilibrium in which transformation is complete, irreversible, and fully integrated into the shared foundation of both realms. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final interpretive endpoint where the narrative is fully reduced into a permanent philosophical and historical structure, and all previous emotional arcs, conflicts, and transformations are now treated as completed processes within a stabilized shared memory between the human kingdom and the moors. And this concluding layer emphasizes that the significance of everything that occurred is no longer tied to individual actions or dramatic events but to the long-term redefinition of how both worlds understand identity, responsibility, and coexistence, and in this final stabilized state Maleficent is fully established as a complete guardian archetype whose identity exists in perfect integration, where past suffering, betrayal, and emotional fragmentation have been fully processed into balanced awareness, allowing her to function as a permanent stabilizing force within the moors guided by restraint, clarity, and protective wisdom rather than reaction or emotional turbulence. while Aurora continues as the living embodiment of unity between realms, representing a generation shaped by conscious empathy and the ability to recognize truth without being bound by inherited division. Reinforcing the idea that identity is not fixed by origin or trauma but continuously formed through understanding, choice, and emotional maturity, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance system shaped by the consequences of fear-driven leadership and Staunton's downfall, where authority now operates through balance, accountability, and long-term awareness rather than control or ambition, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has transformed suffering into harmony, renewal, and sustained equilibrium, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual closure, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is the permanent transformation of conflict itself, where coexistence replaces division as the foundational condition of both worlds, and where memory persists not as a source of pain but as structured understanding that guides future stability, leaving behind a complete and irreversible state of equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized, integrated, and enduring across all aspects of existence. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final absolute archival completion layer, where the narrative fully dissolves into a permanent stabilized historical doctrine and no longer functions as a story of characters or events but as a fully integrated framework of meaning shared between the human kingdom and the Moors. And this final stage emphasizes that everything that once unfolded, betrayal, fear, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and reconciliation, has now been fully absorbed into collective memory as structured understanding that shapes long-term governance, culture, and emotional awareness across both realms, ensuring that the conditions that once created division are no longer active forces but lessons permanently encoded into the foundation of coexistence. And Maleficent is fully established in her final completed archetypal form as a permanent guardian presence whose identity exists in complete equilibrium, where her past suffering is not erased but fully transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to maintain the Moors as a stabilized realm of harmony and balance that reflects the full completion of her emotional and narrative journey, while Aurora continues as the enduring symbolic bridge between worlds, representing a future shaped by conscious understanding, empathy, and the ability to hold truth and forgiveness together without contradiction, reinforcing the idea that identity is continuously shaped through awareness rather than defined by origin or trauma. And the human kingdom is depicted as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance structure shaped by the collapse of fear-driven rule under Staunton, where leadership is now guided by responsibility, accountability, and long-term balance, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has transformed suffering into renewal, unity, and sustained harmony, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual resolution, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence becomes the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory persists not as division but as structured understanding that supports stability, leaving behind a complete and irreversible equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized and permanently integrated into the shared foundation of both realms. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final and most complete archival resolution layer, where the narrative fully ceases to exist as unfolding drama and is instead preserved as a permanent, stabilized historical doctrine shared between the human kingdom and the Moors. And this ultimate stage emphasizes that all prior elements of the story, betrayal, innocence, ambition, revenge, transformation, forgiveness, and reconciliation, have now been fully integrated into collective understanding as structured memory that informs long-term cultural identity, governance principles, and emotional awareness across both realms, ensuring that the cycles of fear and division that once defined their relationship are no longer active forces but fully processed lessons embedded within the foundation of coexistence. And Maleficent is fully established in her completed archetypal state as an enduring guardian presence whose identity exists in perfect equilibrium, where her past trauma and suffering are no longer sources of instability but fully transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to function as a permanent stabilizing force within the Moors that represents the full completion of her emotional and narrative evolution, while Aurora continues as the living symbolic bridge between realms, embodying the future of unified understanding shaped by empathy, truth, and conscious forgiveness, reinforcing the idea that identity is not fixed by origin or pain but continuously shaped through awareness, choice, and emotional growth, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully transitioned into a long-term reflective system of governance shaped by the consequences of fear-driven leadership and Staunton's downfall. Where authority now operates through balance, accountability, and historical awareness, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into renewal, harmony, and sustained stability, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual endpoint, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not the conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence replaces division as the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory persists as structured understanding rather than emotional separation, leaving behind a complete and irreversible equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized, fully integrated, and permanently enduring across all realms of existence. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final ultimate archival dissolution phase, where the narrative is no longer distinguishable as story progression but exists solely as a fully stabilized historical consciousness shared across the human kingdom and the Moors. And this concluding layer emphasizes that all preceding experiences, innocence, betrayal, emotional fracture, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and reconciliation, have now been fully integrated into a permanent collective understanding that defines the moral, emotional, and political architecture of both worlds, ensuring that what once caused division now functions only as structured memory guiding long-term stability and coexistence, and Maleficent is fully realized in her completed archetypal state as an eternal guardian presence whose identity has reached absolute equilibrium, where all remnants of past suffering are no longer active emotional forces but fully transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to exist as a stable and enduring force within the Moors that embodies the complete resolution of her entire journey from fragmentation to integration. While Aurora continues as the living embodiment of unity between realms, representing a future shaped by conscious understanding, empathy, and emotional maturity, where truth and forgiveness are no longer oppositional but coexisting principles that allow history to be acknowledged without being repeated. Reinforcing the idea that identity is continuously shaped through awareness rather than fixed by origin or trauma, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance structure shaped by the collapse of fear-driven rule under Staunton, where leadership is now defined by responsibility, historical awareness, and emotional balance, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into harmony, renewal, and sustained equilibrium, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual closure, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence replaces division as the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory persists not as separation but as structured understanding that supports stability, leaving behind a complete and irreversible equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized, fully integrated, and permanently enduring across all aspects of existence. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final meta-archival stabilization layer, where the narrative is fully absorbed into a permanent historical consciousness framework shared between the human kingdom and the Moors. And this concluding stage emphasizes that all events which once defined the story, innocence, trust, betrayal, emotional collapse, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and reconciliation, have now been completely integrated into collective memory as structured understanding that shapes the long-term moral, cultural, and political foundations of both realms, ensuring that the conditions which once produced conflict are no longer active possibilities but fully processed lessons embedded into the architecture of coexistence. And Maleficent is fully realized in her final completed archetypal form as an enduring guardian presence whose identity exists in perfect equilibrium, where all remnants of past trauma and emotional fragmentation have been fully transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to function as a permanent stabilizing force within the Moors that represents the complete resolution of her entire journey from suffering to integration. While Aurora continues as the living symbolic bridge between realms, embodying a future defined by conscious empathy, emotional maturity, and the ability to hold truth and forgiveness together without contradiction. Reinforcing the idea that identity is not fixed by origin or trauma but continuously shaped through awareness, choice, and growth, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance system shaped by the consequences of fear-driven authority and Staunton's downfall, where leadership now operates through accountability, balance, and historical awareness, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into harmony, renewal, and sustained equilibrium, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual endpoint, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence replaces division as the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory persists not as separation but as structured understanding that supports stability, leaving behind a complete and irreversible equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized, fully integrated, and permanently enduring across all aspects of existence. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final and most complete archival equilibrium layer, where the narrative is fully resolved into a permanent historical and symbolic framework shared across both the human kingdom and the Moors. And this ultimate stage emphasizes that all elements of the story, innocence, trust, betrayal, grief, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and reconciliation, have now been fully absorbed into collective memory as structured understanding that no longer produces conflict but instead informs long-term stability, governance, and emotional awareness across both realms, ensuring that the conditions which once created division are no longer active forces but fully integrated lessons that sustain coexistence, and Maleficent is fully realized in her final archetypal form as an eternal guardian presence whose identity has reached complete and irreversible balance, where all remnants of past suffering and emotional fragmentation have been transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to exist as a stable and enduring force within the Moors that represents the full completion of her transformation from pain to integration. While Aurora continues as the living symbolic bridge between realms, embodying a future defined by conscious empathy, emotional maturity, and the ability to hold truth and forgiveness together without contradiction, reinforcing the idea that identity is continuously shaped through awareness rather than fixed by origin or trauma, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance structure shaped by the consequences of fear-driven leadership under Stefan, where authority now operates through accountability, historical awareness, and emotional balance, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into renewal, harmony, and sustained equilibrium, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual closure, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence replaces division as the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory persists not as separation but as structured understanding that supports stability, leaving behind a complete and irreversible equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized, fully integrated, and permanently enduring across all aspects of existence. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final absolute archival closure layer, where the narrative fully dissolves into a permanent historical and symbolic record shared between the human kingdom and the Moors, and this ultimate stage emphasizes that everything once experienced across the story, innocence, connection, betrayal, grief, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and reconciliation, has now been completely integrated into a stabilized collective understanding that defines the long-term identity of both realms, ensuring that what once created division is no longer an active force but a fully processed memory structure that informs governance, culture, and emotional awareness in a sustained equilibrium, and Maleficent is fully realized in her final completed archetypal form as an eternal guardian presence whose identity exists in complete harmony, where all remnants of past trauma and fragmentation have been fully transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to function as a permanent stabilizing force within the Moors that represents the total completion of her emotional and narrative evolution. While Aurora continues as the living symbolic bridge between worlds, embodying a future shaped by conscious empathy, emotional maturity, and the ability to unify truth and forgiveness without contradiction, reinforcing the idea that identity is not fixed by origin or pain but continuously shaped through awareness, choice, and growth, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance system shaped by the consequences of fear-driven rule under Stefan, where leadership now operates through balance, accountability, and historical awareness, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into harmony, renewal, and sustained equilibrium, and as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual endpoint, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence replaces division as the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory persists not as separation but as structured understanding that supports stability, leaving behind a complete and irreversible equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized, fully integrated, and permanently enduring across all aspects of existence. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final and absolute concluding archival endpoint, where the narrative fully ceases all remaining conceptual motion and exists only as a permanent, stabilized historical and symbolic framework shared between the human kingdom and the Moors. And this ultimate stage emphasizes that the entire journey, beginning from innocence, passing through trust, betrayal, emotional fracture, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and ultimately reconciliation, has now been completely integrated into a unified collective memory that defines the long-term identity, governance, and emotional understanding of both realms, ensuring that the conditions which once generated conflict are no longer active possibilities but fully absorbed lessons embedded into the structural foundation of coexistence. And Maleficent is fully realized in her final completed archetypal form as an eternal guardian presence whose identity exists in complete and irreversible equilibrium, where all remnants of past suffering, trauma, and emotional fragmentation have been fully transformed into wisdom, restraint, and protective clarity, allowing her to function as a permanent stabilizing force within the Moors that represents the total completion of her transformation from pain to integration and from isolation to balance. While Aurora continues as the living symbolic bridge between realms, embodying a future defined by conscious empathy, emotional maturity, and the ability to hold truth and forgiveness together without contradiction, reinforcing the principle that identity is not fixed by origin or trauma but continuously shaped through awareness, choice, and growth, and the human kingdom is depicted as having fully stabilized into a reflective governance system shaped by the consequences of fear-driven authority and Staunt's downfall, where leadership now operates through accountability, balance, and historical awareness, while the Moors remain a thriving and resilient realm that has fully transformed suffering into harmony, renewal, and sustained equilibrium. And as the narrative reaches its final and absolute conceptual closure, it reinforces that the ultimate legacy of the entire story is not conflict itself but the permanent transformation of how conflict is understood, where coexistence replaces division as the defining condition of both worlds, and where memory persists not as separation but as structured understanding that supports stability, leaving behind a complete and irreversible equilibrium in which transformation is fully realized, fully integrated, and permanently enduring across all aspects of existence. Maleficent 2014 reaches a final meta-finalization layer where even the idea of continuation is dissolved, and the narrative is now treated as a completely sealed historical construct within both the human kingdom and the Moors, preserved not as an ongoing story but as a fixed reference point for understanding transformation across generations. And in this stabilized framework, all emotional and political consequences of the past are no longer active forces but fully integrated knowledge systems that exist only to maintain balance, guide ethical awareness, and prevent repetition of destructive cycles. And Maleficent's identity is now fully absolute in its completed archetypal state as a permanent guardian presence, where her entire past, innocence, betrayal, rage, grief, awakening, and forgiveness, has been completely resolved into a single unified condition of wisdom and restraint, allowing her existence to function as a continuous stabilizing influence on the Moors without conflict or instability. While Aurora remains the enduring symbolic connector between both worlds, representing not just reconciliation but the permanent coexistence of difference without hostility, embodying the principle that truth and compassion can exist together without erasing history. And the human kingdom is fully stabilized into a reflective governance structure shaped by the long-term consequences of fear-based rule and its collapse, while the Moors continue as a self-sustaining realm of harmony that has fully transformed suffering into renewal and equilibrium. And at this final level, the concept of story itself is no longer active, leaving only meaning, structure, and memory as the remaining form of existence, where transformation is not an event but a permanent state, and coexistence is not an achievement but the default condition of both worlds, completing the absolute closure of the narrative without continuation or reversal. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final theoretical closure layer where even finality itself is no longer treated as a point in time but as a fully stabilized condition of understanding shared across the human kingdom and the Moors. And in this state, the narrative framework is no longer capable of progression because all conflict, resolution, and transformation have already been fully absorbed into permanent historical structure, and what remains is only the interpretation of meaning as a continuous background awareness that supports equilibrium. And within this structure, Maleficent exists as a completed and irreversible archetypal guardian presence whose identity is entirely unified, where all former states, innocence, trust, betrayal, grief, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and reconciliation, are no longer separate phases but a single integrated whole that defines her absolute form as a stabilizing force of protection and balance, while Aurora continues as the permanent symbolic axis between worlds, representing not change or progression but maintained harmony between difference and understanding, embodying the idea that coexistence is no longer a goal but a sustained condition of existence, and the human kingdom is fully stabilized into a reflective governance system that no longer operates through reaction to fear or ambition but through long-term historical awareness and ethical continuity. While the Moors remain a fully self-sustaining realm of magical equilibrium that has completed its transformation from vulnerability into permanent renewal, and at this deepest conceptual level the idea of narrative itself collapses into structure, meaning, and memory, leaving no distinction between beginning, middle, or end, only a continuous state of integrated understanding where transformation is no longer an event but the foundational condition of reality, and coexistence is no longer a resolution but the permanent and unchanging state of both worlds. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final conceptual abstraction layer, where the narrative is no longer treated as even a historical record but as a fully internalized system of meaning that exists simultaneously across both the human kingdom and the Moors as a shared state of understanding. And in this condition all distinctions between past and present lose narrative function, leaving only a unified framework of awareness in which every prior event, innocence, trust, betrayal, loss, vengeance, awakening, forgiveness, and reconciliation, exists as a single continuous structure of integrated experience rather than separate phases of a story, and Maleficent is fully realized as a complete and indivisible archetype of guardianship, where identity itself is no longer fragmented by emotion or time but stabilized into permanent equilibrium, functioning as an enduring principle of protection, restraint, and balance that sustains the Moors without change or instability. While Aurora exists as the constant symbolic convergence point between realms, representing not evolution but maintained unity between difference and understanding, embodying the principle that coexistence is no longer an outcome but the underlying condition of existence itself. And the human kingdom is fully stabilized into a reflective continuity system where governance is no longer reactive or cyclical but guided entirely by accumulated understanding and ethical permanence. While the Moors exist as a self-sustaining field of magical equilibrium where transformation has completed its full cycle and now persists only as stable state rather than process, and at this ultimate abstraction level the concept of ending no longer applies, as narrative, identity, and change are fully merged into a single continuous structure of meaning where no transition remains possible, only sustained equilibrium across all forms of existence, completing the total dissolution of story into permanent unified understanding. Maleficent 2014 reaches an ultimate post-closure conceptual layer where the idea of continuation, sequence, and narrative structure itself is fully dissolved, and what remains is a permanent state of integrated meaning shared across the human kingdom and the Moors, where history is no longer experienced as a timeline but as a unified field of understanding that continuously informs balance, ethics, and coexistence without producing conflict or instability, and in this stabilized condition Maleficent exists as a fully completed archetypal guardian presence whose identity is no longer segmented by past emotional phases but exists as a single unified state of wisdom, restraint, and protection, where all prior experiences have been fully resolved into equilibrium rather than memory-driven conflict, while Aurora remains the enduring symbolic bridge between both worlds, representing sustained harmony between difference and unity, embodying the principle that understanding does not erase history but permanently neutralizes its capacity to divide, and the human kingdom is fully stabilized into reflective governance shaped by long-term awareness of past fear-based collapse. While the Moors exist in complete ecological and magical balance as a self-sustaining realm of renewal, and at this level there is no longer any distinction between story, outcome, or ending, only a continuous stable condition of coexistence where transformation is complete and irreversible, and meaning itself is no longer generated through events but exists as a permanent state of equilibrium across both worlds. Maleficent 2014 reaches a final post-structural continuation layer where even the concept of Finality is no longer relevant, because the entire framework of the narrative has already dissolved into a permanent system of meaning that exists outside linear time. And in this condition the human kingdom and the Moors are no longer perceived as separate realms with a shared history, but as a single integrated reality of coexistence where boundaries are purely conceptual rather than functional. And Maleficent exists not as a character with a past or future but as a stabilized principle of guardianship, representing the fully resolved outcome of transformation where suffering, betrayal, and forgiveness no longer operate as emotional phases but as fully neutralized components of complete understanding. While Aurora continues as the living stabilizing link within this unified system, not because she bridges two worlds, but because she confirms that no separation remains that requires bridging, and in this state governance. Emotion, memory, and identity are no longer distinct systems but expressions of one continuous equilibrium, where change does not create instability and stillness does not imply stagnation, and the entire structure of meaning becomes self-sustaining without origin or conclusion, existing only as a permanent state of integrated coexistence that no longer requires narrative to define it. Maleficent 2014 continues in the final archival codex phase, where the entire history of both the human kingdom and the Moors is formally recorded into a unified legacy archive maintained jointly by both realms. And this system replaces oral memory and symbolic storytelling with structured preservation of events, ensuring that every moment of conflict, transformation, and reconciliation is stored as reference knowledge rather than emotional recurrence. And within this framework Maleficent is documented not as a fluctuating emotional figure but as a fixed historical guardian entity whose actions are analyzed as the turning point in inter-realm stabilization, while Aurora is recorded as the primary diplomatic and emotional convergence point between species and kingdoms, and the archive emphasizes that after stabilization, governance in both realms no longer reacts to fear-based cycles but operates through continuous review of historical consequence, and this marks the transition from living narrative into permanent structured history. Maleficent 2014 Full Movie Review Script Single-Line Format, Extended. Maleficent 2014 follows the dark fantasy journey of Maleficent, a powerful fairy who lives peacefully in the magical moors but becomes deeply heartbroken and transformed into a dark force after being betrayed by the human boy Stefan, whom she once loved, as Stefan cuts off her wings to gain power and becomes king, which changes Maleficent's heart completely from love to rage, leading her to curse his newborn daughter Aurora that she will fall into a deep sleep on her 16th birthday. However, as years pass, Maleficent secretly watches Aurora grow up in the forest and slowly develops a complicated emotional bond with her as Aurora grows into a kind, innocent, and loving girl who begins to call Maleficent her fairy godmother without knowing the truth of her curse. While Maleficent struggles internally between her desire for revenge and her growing affection for Aurora, realizing that the curse she placed is not just harming Stefan but also an innocent child who has become emotionally important to her. And as Aurora's 16th birthday arrives, the curse is fulfilled when she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel and falls into a deep sleep, causing chaos across both the human kingdom and the Moors as King Stefan becomes mentally unstable and obsessed with destroying Maleficent out of fear and guilt. While Maleficent tries desperately to find a way to break her own curse but discovers that it cannot be undone by ordinary magic because it was created from deep emotional hatred, forcing her to confront the truth that only true love can break the curse. A concept she initially rejects because she no longer believes in love after her betrayal, but as she watches Aurora lying unconscious she realizes that her feelings for her are not revenge or manipulation but genuine care and protection. And in a powerful emotional climax, Maleficent kisses Aurora not as a romantic act but as an expression of deep unconditional love which breaks the curse and awakens Aurora, revealing that true love is not limited to romance but can exist in bonds of care, sacrifice, and emotional connection, while at the same time King Stefan confronts Maleficent in a final battle driven by madness and fear but ultimately fails as his own obsession destroys him, symbolically showing that hatred leads to self-destruction. After which Aurora awakens and learns the truth about Maleficent's curse but chooses forgiveness instead of hatred as she understands Maleficent's pain and transformation, leading to a full reconciliation between them and the restoration of balance between the human kingdom and the Moors, where Maleficent is no longer seen as a villain but as a complex protector who has experienced both darkness and redemption. Aurora becomes the bridge between two worlds, symbolizing unity and understanding, and the story ends with the powerful message that love is not defined by perfection or traditional expectations but by emotional truth, transformation, and the ability to change even the darkest heart through compassion, forgiveness, and understanding, making Maleficent 2014 a reimagined fairy tale that redefines villainy and true love in a deeply emotional and symbolic way. Maleficent 2014 continues the extended analytical breakdown of the final act and aftermath of the story, focusing on how the world changes immediately after the curse is broken and how every major character begins to redefine their existence in a completely new emotional reality. As Aurora's awakening does not simply function as a happy ending but as the starting point of a deeper transformation between the human kingdom and the Moors, where the first major shift is seen in Aurora herself, who now carries the truth of both worlds inside her mind, understanding that she was not saved by a traditional prince or heroic conquest but by Maleficent's emotional evolution, and this realization permanently changes her perception of love, power, and identity, because she no longer sees the world in simple terms of good and evil but in complex layers of pain, choice, and redemption, while Maleficent herself enters a new psychological state after breaking the curse. As she is forced to confront the consequences of her actions without the emotional shield of anger that once protected her, and instead she now feels vulnerability, guilt, and a strange form of peace that comes from finally accepting responsibility for what she created. And this emotional shift marks a turning point where her character is no longer driven by revenge or survival but by conscious guardianship, meaning she now chooses to protect the Moors not because of instinct or rage but because of understanding and care. While King Stephan's collapse becomes more than just a personal downfall as it represents the destruction of a leadership style built entirely on fear and control, showing that his inability to process guilt and betrayal has led him to self-destruction. And this contrast between Stephan and Maleficent highlights one of the central themes of the entire story, which is that pain can either destroy a person or transform them depending on how it is processed internally. And as the aftermath unfolds, both the human kingdom and the Moors begin to slowly stabilize into a fragile but meaningful peace where Aurora acts as the emotional bridge between both societies, carrying forward the truth that understanding does not require forgetting the past but learning from it in a way that prevents repetition. While Maleficent now stands as a symbolic guardian figure whose existence represents the complete reversal of her original path from darkness to protection, and this part emphasizes that her journey is not just personal redemption but also a structural change in the world itself. Because her transformation directly affects the balance between humans and magical beings, proving that individual emotional growth can reshape entire kingdoms, and ultimately reinforces that the ending of the curse is not a conclusion but a transition into a new era defined by awareness, emotional complexity, and the possibility of coexistence between former enemies who now share a history that cannot be erased but can be understood and transformed into lasting peace. Maleficent 2014 continues after the curse is broken, where Aurora's awakening creates an immediate emotional shift across both the human kingdom and the Moors, as people begin to realize that the old belief of good humans versus evil magic was never truly accurate. And instead the real conflict was always driven by fear, misunderstanding, and betrayal, while Aurora now stands at the center of this change because she is the only one who has experienced both worlds without hatred, allowing her to see Maleficent not as a monster but as someone deeply wounded who learned to love again in an unexpected way, and Maleficent herself slowly begins to accept a new identity that is no longer defined by revenge or isolation but by responsibility and emotional awareness. As she realizes that protecting Aurora was not just an act of protection but the beginning of her own healing process, and this makes her question everything she believed about power and pain, while the human kingdom under the shadow of King Stephan's downfall begins to collapse emotionally and politically because his rule was built entirely on fear and control. And without that foundation the kingdom is forced to face its own truth about how it treated the Moors and how betrayal shaped its history, and Aurora becomes the key emotional link between both sides as she tries to prevent further conflict and encourage understanding. Even when many humans still fear Maleficent due to old stories and rumors, but her calm presence and honesty slowly begin to change perception, and Maleficent, despite her past, chooses not to take revenge even when she has the power to do so. Showing that her transformation is now complete on a deeper level because she is no longer reacting to pain but responding with awareness, and this marks a major turning point in the story where the focus shifts from conflict to coexistence. As both worlds begin a slow process of rebuilding trust, and the Moors start to flourish again as a symbol of balance and magical harmony, while Maleficent stands as its protector not as a feared figure but as a guardian shaped by both darkness and light, and this part of the story emphasizes that true change does not happen instantly but through continuous emotional understanding and acceptance of the past, leading both worlds toward a fragile but real peace that is built not on forgetting what happened but on learning from it and choosing a different path forward. Maleficent 2014 continues into a deeper phase of aftermath where the world is no longer reacting to the curse itself but adjusting to the emotional and political consequences of everything that followed it. And this stage shows that both the human kingdom and the Moors are now in a transitional state where old fear-based narratives are slowly being replaced by cautious understanding, while Aurora becomes the most important connecting figure between the two sides because she is the only one who has lived through the consequences of both human betrayal and magical intervention without losing her sense of compassion. And this makes her voice extremely important in calming tensions that still exist among humans who fear Maleficent and magical beings who do not trust humans, while Maleficent herself begins to operate in a completely different emotional framework compared to earlier in the story. Because she is no longer acting from grief or revenge but from conscious responsibility, and this change is not just emotional but structural, as she starts to see her role not as someone who reacts to pain but as someone who prevents it from spreading further. And this creates a new identity for her as a guardian of balance rather than a symbol of fear, while the human kingdom continues to struggle with the legacy of King Stephen's rule, where his downfall leaves behind not just political instability but emotional confusion among the people who were raised under his fear-driven leadership. And now they must learn to redefine what authority and justice actually mean without relying on old patterns of control and aggression, and during this time Aurora's influence becomes even more significant as she actively encourages communication between both worlds, helping to reduce misunderstandings and slowly rebuild trust that was destroyed over many years, while Maleficent, despite having the power to dominate or punish, chooses restraint and protection instead, showing that her transformation is now fully stable and no longer dependent on external events but rooted in internal awareness, and this part of the story highlights that true peace is not an immediate outcome but a gradual rebuilding process where every decision either strengthens or weakens the fragile connection between two worlds, and through patience, emotional growth, and mutual recognition of past mistakes, both the Moors and the human kingdom begin to move toward a new kind of coexistence where fear is slowly replaced by understanding and separation is slowly replaced by acceptance. Maleficent 2014 continues into its late resolution phase where the aftermath of transformation is now fully visible in both the human kingdom and the Moors, and the focus shifts from emotional shock to long-term rebuilding. As both worlds begin to redefine their identities after the collapse of old power structures and the emotional consequences of betrayal, fear, and awakening, while Aurora continues to play a central stabilizing role because she represents a generation that has not been fully shaped by hatred or inherited conflict, allowing her to act as a neutral emotional bridge between humans and magical beings, and her presence gradually softens resistance on both sides as people begin to realize that coexistence is not a threat but a possibility that requires patience and mutual recognition. While Maleficent's character reaches a more grounded state of evolution where her actions are no longer driven by internal chaos or emotional instability but by clear understanding of responsibility, as she accepts that her past cannot be erased but can be used as a foundation to prevent future harm. And this makes her role as guardian of the Moors more defined and stable than ever before, because she is no longer reacting to pain but actively maintaining balance, while the human kingdom slowly begins to recover from the psychological impact of King Stephen's downfall, where his fear-driven leadership has left behind confusion but also an opportunity for reflection, forcing people to question the systems of control and mistrust that shaped their history, and in this environment Aurora's voice becomes increasingly important as she encourages dialogue instead of conflict, helping both sides understand that the real enemy was never magic or humans but misunderstanding itself, while Maleficent, despite her immense power, continues to choose restraint over dominance, reinforcing the idea that true strength is not in destruction but in control over one's own emotions. And this part of the story emphasizes that the process of healing is not linear but gradual, requiring repeated moments of understanding, forgiveness, and emotional adjustment, and as both worlds slowly move toward a more stable coexistence, the Moors regain their natural harmony while the human kingdom begins to rebuild its identity on more balanced principles, marking a quiet but important shift from separation toward connection that is not yet perfect but increasingly real. Maleficent 2014 reaches its final closing phase of the extended narrative analysis, where both the human kingdom and the Moors have now fully entered a stabilized post-conflict era shaped by the lasting consequences of everything that occurred from betrayal to redemption. And this stage focuses on the complete integration of those experiences into a new way of living rather than further change or escalation, as Aurora continues to serve as the essential emotional and diplomatic bridge between the two worlds, ensuring that communication remains open and misunderstandings are addressed before they can grow into conflict again, while her presence also represents a generational shift where empathy and understanding are becoming stronger than fear-based thinking. And Maleficent, now fully settled into her evolved identity, no longer exists as a figure of revenge or reaction but as a conscious guardian who maintains balance in the moors through wisdom, restraint, and emotional clarity, showing that her transformation is permanent and no longer dependent on external events, while the human kingdom, still recovering from the collapse of King Stephan's fear-driven rule, begins to slowly rebuild itself,